So I can see that I can tighten some of those bits up there. Okay, I've got that bit. I'm going to sit down again. So what I'm going to do now is just sort of tighten up the form a little bit. I'm not going to press down any harder. I'm just going to not necessarily outline, because we're not made of outlines, but give a better understanding of where the dark and lights are on her. And then we'll push the whole thing back into the paper a bit using a tissue or a piece of cotton wool. And what that does is it helps to both tone the page a little bit, to make it sit well in the page. It gets rid of a lot of those guidelines, and it gives it sort of a misty look, which is really lovely to then work another layer on. And sometimes when I'm doing this, I'll push things back 2 or 3 times before I bring in the proper, like the final, not proper, the final layer. So it's about working in layers. Using graphite is very similar to painting in that aspect. You know, you don't necessarily go, you're not necessarily happy with that first, or it's not necessarily a finished piece, I guess is what I'm getting at, with a single layer of graphite. You often need to go in and do multiple layers. As you start to darken up one area, you'll see other areas that need darkening up. And, you know, utilising the darks is also a way to make the lights shine as well. So there's that aspect as well. Okay. So I'm still looking at the reference more than I'm looking at the page. And I'm just sort of defining some of these lines a little bit more. So instead of holding it right back here and very loosely lining, I'm down a little bit. I'm about 2/3 down on the barrel of the pencil. And I'm doing shorter, sharper lines now. I'm not pressing any harder. But this allows me to sort of define an area a little more. So being really present in your observation means, you know, taking your breath, taking some time to really view your subject matter, and to not let, or to work hard to prevent, your brain to tell you stories about how something should actually look. And you're going to have to excuse, there's a lot of birds in my yard, and I don't really hear them now. I hear them all the time. But you're going to hear lots of birds carrying on in the backyard because it's spring here and everybody's nesting. And I feed the wild birds, so they come to my yard to both get some feed and also to start to use it as a creche as the babies start to hatch too, which is really lovely, but it can get a bit noisy. At this point, I'm not too concerned about using my eraser because I know that I'm going to push things back. And that in itself is a bit of fun because, you know, you can see if something's not right and you're like, oh, I just want to erase it. But I know that that will come as I start to define this layer a little bit more. So I'm just really lightly putting in a representation, I guess, more than anything else for the eyes, just so I know where they are in space. I'm not going into detail with them yet because when I push these back, all that detail would be erased anyway, would disappear. So it's more about sort of putting some value down in areas where I know that there should be. It's quite loose. And when it comes to hands, it's exactly the same thing. So look at everything as shapes. Try not to think of it as a hand and be overwhelmed by the thought of having to do fingers and weird angles. Just look at it as a shape. Going through all of the same sort of shapes as we did with the purple on Procreate. You can see that it's still very loose, but that there's a bit of definition now in the forms. These are funny things, aren't they? But where will we be without them? So I can see that here, for example, her leg is not long enough. If I put the fig leaf way down here, so this is where the fig leaf needs to go, not all the way down here. But I'm not going to worry about that for the moment. I will push that back and redefine that, give you some length of leg there. These are the things that you discover as you go along. And I love this little detail where her toes are coming off the sort of stage of the plinth there. I think that's really lovely. Okay, I'm just having a little look now as to where everything is, if I've got them relatively close to proportionate. And if I'm happy with her. Her neck could be a little bit longer, but that's okay. Okay, I think that that's good for our first go round. So I've just got my tissue, or maybe I'll use, actually, I think I might use a cotton wool ball. This one's got a little bit of graphite on it already, and a cat hair, because there's always cat hairs everywhere here. And I'm just pushing it back lightly. I'm not scrubbing it into the page by any means. I'm just sort of letting gravity mostly do the work, giving it a little push. And now you can see, magically, all those guidelines are gone, and she's this nice misty sort of looking creature. And then we can go in and define her a little bit further. So I think I'll stick with my bee for now. What I want to do is go back in again and redefine some of these areas. I'm actually going to add some shading in at the same time. And there's a few different ways you can do shading, and it depends on how detailed you want to get in whatever it is that you're doing. So there's, you know, hatching, where you're using a single line, and then, you know, you tighten up the line or press harder on the line to give a darker value versus a lighter value. There's cross hatching, and you can give form quite well with some cross hatching, you know, make things look rounded out, for example. There's stippling, where you use a bunch of dots. You can shade by doing lots of tiny little circles. And you can get some really nice definition in that shade. It's very soft. The more you go over an area, the darker it is, and that's kind of the sort of shading that I tend to do, more sort of circular. And you can do like a scribble motion too, moving in all different directions. The thing that you want to watch with that is that you don't have any like hard finish lines that you then exacerbate by adding the next layer on, this sort of hard stop line of your pencil, unless that's the look you're actually going for. So for this exercise, I will probably mostly do a mix between a scribble and a circular sort of motion, where, you know, if there's a darker area, I will, maybe if it's long, I will define it more in a sort of scribble motion, and then lighten the way that the pencil is approaching the paper, so lighten that contact in order to make the shading lighter. And then, you know, you just keep playing with it. You keep going back. If you need it darker, you come back in again afterwards and make it darker. But you're constantly looking at your whole piece and making sure that the values work across the piece well, so that, you know, the values match. So the darkest dark in one area is the same value as the darkest dark in a different area, sorry, provided they're the same medium. So in this marble, we can see some of the darkest darks are here under her arm here on the side of her chest. There's a little bit in this elbow here, between her legs here, and over some of the knee. The snake on this side, and then, you know, there's very darker lines around the fig leaves here. Then we've got like a medium darkness in different spots on her six-pack, her very defined stomach. And then we've got like lighter areas that aren't white, they're lighter, and then some very stark whites. Okay, so they're the things that I'll be looking at as I start to sort of shade her body in there. Okay, and I tend to, I love doing eyes, so when we get to do her face, I'll probably really focus on those eyes more than anything else. I always feel like if you can get the eyes right on a piece, then it doesn't matter if the proportions are wrong anywhere else. That's what matters, the eyes, and that's the thing you'll be drawn to. So what I'll probably do is come in and find all the darkest parts first. And I'm not going to be really dark. I'm not laying down really dark in this part. I'm going to, I'll do like a medium darkness, I suppose. And then I can come back to it and do more as I sort of define the form a bit more and know exactly where I want to put those darks. So continuing to just really look at the reference, and I'm looking at shapes. I'm looking at the shapes of the darkness. So always looking for shapes. And together those shapes create form. And I want to try and leave the spots that have got the highlights for me to put the white down. I don't want to put too much grey underneath that, because when I put the, I don't want to put too much graphite underneath that, because when I put the white over the top, you'll get like a grey instead of a nice bright white. So I do want to define that fig a little more, fig leaf. Actually made this one, the top, a little bit too big, so I'm just going to pull, share my ears, this fellow, push that back a little bit. It's better. So in this instance, I'm not going for a hyper-realistic look. I'm going for an honouring of what I can see in front of me. So I'm thinking about, as I'm doing this, I'm thinking about both the archetype of Eve herself. I'm thinking about the great skill of the sculptor. Thinking about how profound it is to have that connection to like a creative well, a creative source. And I'm also considering, as I do this shading, that these are 3D figures, forms in space. Okay, so they're not flat. So I want to remember that what I'm shading is rounded. And a good way to do that is to actually shade in volume. So if you've got like the arm there, is to shade the way that the volume presents, so rounded. It's very rough, but I hope you get the idea. To help make something look rounded, okay? Approach this hand, and I can actually see that her hand is probably a little bit too far from her body to be exactly like the reference. It's okay. Just approaching it as a shape, the same as every other part of her body. And I'm not needing to get into too much detail for this piece here, for this study. We're just getting a feel for Eve. going to continue that process, exactly what we've been doing to now, for the rest of this layer. I'll speed this up a little bit for you. And then I'll pipe back in again once we start to add a bit more darks and I've got something to talk to you more about. Okay, so that's our first round of her done. And if I was really going to sort of render this a lot more, then I would probably push this layer back as well, with doing the same thing, so with a cotton ball with some tissue paper, and go again. But this is a light study. This is me just trying to get my head around the amazing sculpture that I'm looking at, to warm my hand up to get some understanding of the form of the statue itself. That's not going to be the main focus of my study today. I mean, it's important nevertheless, and if you have more time to spend on that, and if you want to, certainly go right ahead. Spend as much time as you would like on it. But what I'm going to do now is just really sort of darken up some of these darker areas, which I've started to do while I'm talking to you. And I just want to add in a few of those little highlights. I'm going to leave the paper itself as the primary mid-tone. And I don't feel like I need to do too much more definition outside of that, I've enjoyed this little practice, and I'm eager to get on to really looking at her head, her face, and putting some study into that. Just darken up some of the areas that are most dark, like this area between the legs here. Oop, just a bit too hard.